Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. So I thought I'd open this episode with another story because I think it speaks to why we're drawn to ancient treasure and perhaps even what treasure really is. So this story is about the discovery of the tomb of the ancient Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun in 1922 by the British Egyptologist Howard Carter. During the First World War, he'd been scouring the Valley of the Kings. You may be familiar with the Valley of the Kings. It's this valley on the west bank of the Nile where a lot of the tombs of these ancient pharaohs were found. And he had the financial backing of George Herbert, the fifth Earl of Carnarvon. If you've seen the TV series Downton Abbey, you'll be familiar with his country house, which is actually called Highclere Castle. Anyway, on November 26th of 1922, Carter, assisted by his colleague Arthur Callender, was standing at the end of an underground passage they had reached by excavating a staircase leading from the surface. Their way was now blocked by a sealed door, in which Carter made a tiny hole. With trembling hands, according to a book on the discovery that he co-wrote with Arthur Mace, a colleague of his. Behind them stood Carnarvon and his daughter Lady Evelyn. At first, the space beyond seemed just dark and empty until Carter enlarged the hole and got a candle through it. And in his book, he writes, "At first, I could see nothing, the hot air escaping from the chamber, causing the candle flame to flicker. But presently, as my eyes grew accustomed to the light, details of the room within emerged slowly from the mist. Strange animals, statues, and gold everywhere, the glint of gold." Asked by Carnarvon if he could see anything, Carter famously replied, "Yes, wonderful things," though it seems there are some minor variances in exactly how he worded that. So was discovered the tomb of the pharaoh Tutankhamun, one of the most spectacular finds in the history of archaeology. There's something captivating about this story. I mean, obviously the discovery of treasure is always going to be exciting, but there are other elements at play here too. For example, I think there's something about delving, digging down and finding something in a secret dark room, that one that hasn't been occupied in thousands of years, that just seems to kind of catch us. What makes it so compelling? It seems to give us a special kind of frisson, I think, that would be different if it were just a story about finding treasure in the middle of a field, for example. I'm hesitant to reduce this to too simple an explanation, to just one dimension, but I do find what you could call a psychoanalytic interpretation kind of tempting here. This story just sort of suggests a kind of symbolism, an idea that I think we all, or at least many of us, share on some level, that if we could just dig down and reach the core of ourselves, it would be like finding a secret treasure room. We have this notion that we could tap a vast inner energy, maybe, like the one William James spoke about, or unlock something of great importance, something to do with our childhood, perhaps, but that something that might bring our life together in some way, something that's been buried over by the hard crust of our later experiences and assumptions, the freeing of which might imbue our lives with new hope and dynamism. Perhaps I'm taking this too far, but I do think it speaks to what seems to make this such a compelling image. This is of course both Freudian and Proustian, this idea that I'm talking about of going deep inside for some inner treasure. And so it's funny because it seems like the oddest coincidence that Carter's discovery tracked the work of Freud and Proust so closely, because Proust died still working on his masterpiece In Search of Lost Time on the 18th of November, 1922. And that was just about a week before Carter discovered Tutankhamun's treasure room. And Freud must have been working to finish The Ego and the Id at about the same time, because that was published a few months later in April 1923. Anyway, I think another element of what makes the story of Carter's discovery so compelling is that it raises on some level the question of what constitutes treasure, or at least the kind of treasure that makes such a compelling story. I don't think the story would be so memorable, for instance, if Carter had just found a huge sum in government bonds or something, instead of, as he put it, strange animals, statues, and gold. And everywhere the glint of gold. What we're talking about here, I think, is really cultural wealth. I mean, sure, the fact that it's made in this metal that we all find that society values so much is important, but this stuff is also priceless in a way that goes far beyond the precious materials it's made from. These artworks were shaped by people driven to make permanent in these materials, to sort of incarnate in them the essence of life as they understood it, individually and communally, the essence of their own lives and that of their whole civilization, the civilization that had given birth to them and in which they'd grown up. And so I think there's another symbolism at work here. Carter's peering into the treasure room also suggests, to me anyway, the work of history itself, the study of those who have come before us, which is often best done by studying their artifacts and reading their writings. It's an act of digging down, in a way, through all the strata that separate their time from ours. And often those who do this digging are dazzled by the pricelessness of what they seem to find. So, but why do these books and these other cultural artifacts, artworks, seem so priceless to us anyway? Well, seeing them and reading old books can be rewarding in a way that isn't easy to quantify, because you find out so many interesting things. Typically, in books, we find these interesting things out, and in studying artifacts also. Although I think art, one thing that makes art different in a way from these texts, some of these texts, is that it can affect us, I think, without even being consciously aware of how it's affecting us. Whereas in books, we're more likely to think, oh, that's an interesting idea. Anyway, what is it exactly that makes these cultural works so fascinating? I think the answer to this question kind of ultimately makes the two symbolisms I've been talking about, the symbolism of psychotherapy and the symbolism of the work of history, actually kind of come together, converge in a really interesting way. At first, it might seem odd that we in the 21st century would find these old books, these buried treasures, so valuable. There's a sense today, and I think it's, to some extent it's spoken, to some extent it's a kind of unspoken assumption that the light of reason, science, progress have made earlier forms of life, the forms that these old books and artworks capture, these largely traditional forms, obsolete, actually. And it is undeniable that culture before our own time was permeated with superstition and cruelty, so much so that hoping to find in it any guidance for life in our own times can seem at the very least, questionable, if not downright harmful. Throughout history and around the world, the societies that have preceded ours have been prone to all sorts of harmful practices, including, according to the late UCLA anthropologist Robert Edgerton, witchcraft, violence, slavery, infanticide, human sacrifice, torture, rape, the oppression of women, cruelty to animals, and disregard for the environment also, as well as generally unscientific beliefs and customs. Ancient civilizations like Egypt, of course, rested on the work of armies of slaves. Incest was common among ancient Egypt's ruling families. In fact, Tutankhamun's parents were brother and sister. The ancient Greeks' treatment of slaves in galleys and silver mines seemed to show no concern for human suffering. Sexual, class, and ethnic prejudice were common even among the highly educated. Aristotle, one of the greatest philosophical minds ancient Greece produced, wrote in his Poetics, quote, "Even a woman may be good and also a slave, though the woman may be said to be an inferior being, and the slave quite worthless." Unquote. There can be a very high level of cruelty in ancient Greek life and literature. You see a lot of cruelty in Homer, for example. At the end of the Odyssey, Odysseus cuts off the ears, nose, and genitals of the goatherd who had taken the side of the suitors, and he hangs all the female slaves who did. And as we'll see when we get to Plato, classical Greece seemed more or less accepting of a type of sexual relationship that can seem quite questionable to us today. By our standards, it's probably fair to call all of the cultures that preceded our own, in Edgerton's words, sick societies. How then could anything found in them be useful to us today? And if it's not useful, why would we find it interesting? I think the answer is that history can be therapeutic. Of course, I'm not suggesting it as a replacement for psychotherapy for people who need this or would benefit from it. But I do think it can heal the psyche in an important way and lead us to fuller lives. For one thing, nothing comes simply from nothing, and the ideas that shape our own time have their origin in the past, ultimately in those cultures that we now consider obsolete. But I don't believe our education normally captures this. And so we're all to some extent walking around with unquestioned assumptions, ideas that our modern society takes more or less to be unquestionably true. By going back in time, reading the old books in which these ideas originated, we become conscious of the origin of the ideas that have gone into our own making. So history, or if you like, the humanities, like psychotherapy, raises the unconsciousness to consciousness, ideally. Sometimes our consciousness can be expanded by this process because if we open ourselves to these older ideas, we can find ourselves challenged to question our assumptions. We may find, for example, that we don't agree with the reasons why an earlier way of thinking has been rejected. We might come to ask ourselves whether it in fact might hold great promise for us, individually and perhaps even for our time. And that's really what spurred me to create this series about Platonic love. I think this is actually also the same reason why traveling to different countries today can be stimulating, refreshing, and exhilarating, maybe occasionally exhausting. Encountering the other has the potential to change us, I think, for the better. And finally, I think history can alleviate that sense of melancholy alienation I've been talking about so much in this series. You might remember how in one of my earlier episodes I talked about the deep melancholy in which the narrator of Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time found himself in the work's opening chapter. His sense of alienation from his wonder-filled childhood in the town of Cambrai seemed to lend a certain subtle hopelessness to his everyday existence. He talks about having a cheerless day and facing a depressing morrow at one point. I should never have had any wish to ponder over this residue of Cambrai, he tells the reader. To me, it was in reality all dead. I think there's something similar going on in the West today on a societal level. All the previous forms of life that we find in history tell the story of humans coping as well as they can with the challenges life presented them with, and trying to make sense of it all. And so if we simply take them as obsolete, we end up in a state of alienation from universal humanity. And just as Marcel's sense of being cut off from his own personal past had been part of his limbo-like state, so our sense of other ways of being human, being simply in the dustpan of history, cuts us off also from a richness beyond our imagining. And just as his regaining of this past time was triggered by his tasting of the Madeleine, there can be moments that call us too back to oneness with other forms of human life. Not an uncritical oneness, but a kind of living oneness, a oneness of thinking and reflection. Seeing previous ways of thinking as simply outmoded is a mistake we make at our peril, unless we've ascertained with certainty that they have nothing to offer us. There's something universal about human nature, something that allows humans to relate to culture on some level everywhere. To read old books, to travel outside one's own culture at all, is to travel to a place where there is at once much that is foreign, even quite repugnant, and yet much that's startlingly beautiful and mysterious, unforgettable because it speaks to the universal human story. And hearing this story can actually transform us. I realize I haven't really lived up to the promise I made at the end of my last episode that I would start delving into the work of Plato, or the world of Plato. There were a few things that I wanted to talk about before we dive into ancient Greece. But this is what we'll be doing next episode, specifically talking about how the ancient idea of philosophy is in a way very different from how philosophy is understood today. Anyway, I hope you can join me then, and thanks for watching.